Welcome back everyone to the 8th presentation in this course. After finishing with the 7 aesthetics last week, we are now moving on into the themes, and the first one is food, the necessities of containment. This is a photograph of the oldest noodles ever found by archaeologists, and it happened when an earthquake hit in China and the bowl fell upside down on the ground, covering the noodles. And when the archaeologists found the bowl, they uncovered it and the noodles were visible. The photograph was taken instantly, and then the noodles disappeared. So we have a trace of the origin of noodles in China from that very ancient bowl that protected them. In Darfur, in Sudan, in the contemporary world, there is a war going on that more or less ended recently, and villages were completely destroyed. But when the inhabitants returned, they would find grain left into those pots, and they could cook a bit of food and resume life after their village being destroyed. So this is again a connection between ceramic and food that's quite interesting in terms of preserving life after destruction. Granaries made out of raw clay are found all over the world in ancient times and all the way to today. They permit the preservation of grains and other food staples from rodents. They're usually elevated from the ground, and their entrance is protected from whoever may want to steal the material inside. This is a photograph of a boat wreck with Chinese porcelain lying at the bottom of the ocean. So you can see that the boat and everything else it contained more or less completely disappeared, but the porcelain have been protected due to the archival quality of the material, and a large number of those wrecks exist in the oceans of the world and are discovered by divers and archaeologists all the time. There are many representations of people making food in art and in small ceramic figurines. You have 2 examples of that here with bread making scenes. Those are 2 examples from Greece, 500 BC, and bread making scenes again with ovens and various ways of cooking the bread. So from those small objects, those quite unassuming objects that were made again as offering in tombs for deceased, for the afterlife, we learn about how bread was made and how it was cooked and how it was processed. The same here in China. Again, funerary offerings in tombs, grain processing. Molds from Armana in Egypt, so very ancient objects from the cultures of Egypt. The dough was put into those cone-like forms and then cooked in ashes and coals so that you could dispense from the need for a oven to make the bread. And on the right, those very interesting clay balls. Clay balls were fired clay that were then heated up at a very high temperature in a bonfire, and once they were hot, they were dropped into a liquid to warm it up or cook it. Very early use of ceramics to cook for cooking. This is an example of a yomon container from Japan, from Neolithic Japan, and archaeologists could scrape the interior and find out that the remains were actually from fish. So we can even find, from those containers the kind of food people were harvesting and growing and cooking and eating. And I've shown you those standardized wares for feeding workforce similar amount of food before. This is an image of cheese contained in a ceramic object dating from 3,200 years old from Egyptian time. And another example that's only 300 years old from Kalmar in Sweden, containing cheese again that was preserved in a screw-top jar all that time. And cheese and ceramics have a very interesting connections. Those caves in Marwal in France are for the aging of cheese, and because the caves are lined with brick tiles, floor and ceilings, the temperature and the humidity is constant, which is perfect for the aging of cheese. A very interesting objects from Roman time discovered in Pompeii and in many other locations over the Roman world are those containers for the breeding of mice. Mice were a food in Roman time, and a household would have such a pot which would contain mice. They would be fed into those containers, and the ramp is for their exercising so that they could run up and down the ramp and create more muscle mass for the need of the protein need of the Romans. A chicken feeder from Pompeii as well. So grain was put into the cylinder and the chicken could peek at it and get their food that way. Very ancient cookbooks. The earliest cookbooks we have are from Mesopotamia in the cuneic form script of writing, which we will look into in a coming theme. And those are recipes for roasting birds from 1750 BCE, so almost 4,000 years old. Models of stove from China, again made in as miniature to be put in tombs, and on the right an example from Greece, an actual example of a stove in Greece for the cooking of food. Islamic pottery is full of interesting material that we will look again further on in the text theme chapter, but they often have inscriptions related to food and fasting. So the one on the left says the sacred month of Ramadan, which was a month of fasting, where food could only be consumed after sunset and before sunrise. And the one on the right reads, frugality is the sign of poverty. I really like those beautiful fish plates from Greece. Whether they were used for the cooking or serving of fish remains to be debated, but they were certainly serving plates, and the fact that images of fish are found of them just add to their connections to food. We have a lot of examples of pots in use, and those are two examples here. And the Greek at symposiums, when men would meet with women entertaining them, they would drink a lot of wine, and the lees of the wine remaining in the calyx cup would be thrown at the wall. And those are two examples of that game being played, that game of kotobos, played at symposium in Greece. I'm showing you this example of a Chinese breakfast service made at Sèvres in 1840. And I doubt it was ever used by anyone. It's an object of, show off for display to show the skill of the makers, the extreme approach to making with a double wall to most of the object, and so on and so forth. But in the end, it's just meant to exist as a display thing. There are quite a few examples of that in the history of ceramics. Things for the table that were for ostentatious display of wealth, of taste, and of how sophisticated you were. And this is a Meissen porcelain table centerpiece. And those kinds of objects were made in large quantities for the aristocrats. They tended to be used. People would actually use those things for salt and pepper, oil and vinegar, and so on and so forth on aristocratic and very, very wealthy people tabletops. This is an example of a Meissen porcelain table centerpiece again, and this one is shown blank before painting and gilding took place. And then you have the same object here after painting and gilding, and you can see how it transformed the thing and adds to its ostentatiousness. It was designed by Candler, the great modeler working at Meissen, and it dates from 1737. So again, I'm showing you the blank version and the color version with the detail to show how it's been changed. So Meissen figurines were made specifically to be inserted in tableaus that would occupy the center of a tabletop, and all kinds of scenes would be described into those figurines and their interaction and so on and so forth, and this would generate conversation at the table. At Meissen as well, Candler designed the swan service, which is a wonderful service in porcelain with a swan motif. It contains 2,000 pieces, which were broken up and distributed all over the world. You see them in most museums that has ceramic collection. And it's quite a beautiful dinner service with the low relief modeling of two swans in a pond with armorial designs around the rim, and it's quite an exquisite set, and you will see example of it here and there if you travel and visit museums of ceramics and museums with collections of ceramics. There are also versions where the design is painted, and I find that a little bit more dubious and not so successful. I've shown you before the frog service made at Wedgwood in 1773 for Catherine the Great of Russia, and this is an example here with a view of England. And in the set contains, I believe, around 1,200 objects, and each one has a different scene of England painted on each work. I've also shown you in the industrial aesthetics the work of Thomas Cole, who was the first one to design an all-white dinner service, something tremendously influential in subsequent taste development in dinnerware making all the way to today. Meissen porcelain often imitates Asian types. You have an example from Imari and Kakiyamon and Nabeshima here. So various type of Asian ceramics were copied in Europe, and Meissen was at the origin of porcelain making in Europe and at the origin of copying Asian forms and Asian decorative motif on the porcelain. Those are examples of storage jars from Turkey. In many archaeological sites worldwide, we find ceramic objects for the containment and preservation of food and the storage of food, and those are examples from Turkey from very antique times. Examples from Crete at Akritori site. Again, very large jars would have contained water, oil, grains of all kinds, and be the refrigerator of their days, basically. Very large granaries, again, at Knossos in Crete. Those are human scale, they're very big pots, and they would have contained a large quantity of preserved material for the needs of the palace. Storage jars for wine from the tomb of Tutankhamun. And on those jars is indicated the origin of the wine, the name of the maker, the vintage, and the type of wine it is. This is an example of the very earliest winemaking in Georgia from 8,000 years ago. So the first country in terms of archaeology where we find the origin of winemaking is Georgia, and previously a Russian republic from Soviet times, but now an independent country. And this is an example here from today. People still make wine in Georgia today using the same technology, the same large vessel in fired clay that are sunk into the ground, and where the temperature of the wine and the development of winemaking can be controlled. So wine and beer and all kinds of alcoholic beverage are made all over the world. This is an example of beer making in China from 3000 BCE. An example from Pompeii in Roman time. And an example from Peru where chicha was brewed as an alcoholic beverage in those types of vessels. So we find a wide variety of different forms for different purposes. You have an octopus trap from Minoan time in Crete on the left. It would be sunk into the ocean. From the very small opening on top, an octopus could go in and hide herself or itself. And then the fisherman would retrieve the trap from the ocean and using a metal hook pull the octopus out. And there is an image of the octopus itself on the jar, which creates an interesting connection between the object, its form, its decoration, and its purpose. And on the right we have a Roman vessel with depressions on its side and textures as well, so that it is easy to grab and handle as you use it for cooking. So I'm showing you a variety of different forms and different cooking pots from different cultures. Those are from China, from the Neolithic period. Other examples from China where a fire could be set underneath and warm or boiled or cook whatever material was contained inside. Example for beekeeping, where smokers would be used to control and tame the bees as honey would be collected. From Crete again, and on the right from Papua Guinea, a smoke pot which would be suspended over a fire containing meats or other materials that would be smoked and thus preserved. We find all kinds of different ovens in ceramic all over the world as well. Those are examples from Pueblo, North America on the left, and from Africa on the right. They're usually made out of raw clay and later on with bricks. This is an example of a tandoor from India and Pakistan. They're always made out of ceramics because it's the perfect material for the absorption of heat and its slow release to cook the bread. Rocket stove are an interesting invention that dates back in time in various cultures, but have been reformulated recently for ecological reason, because using compressed newspaper, you can burn it into the stove and it generates enough heat to boil a fair bit of water. And Ronald Black, when he was a graduate student at Emily-Carr, redesigned such a rocket stove and proved its efficiency by actually using it. Another type of container for specific purposes is those ongi pots for the making of kimchi in Korea. And the Diwali Light Festival in India uses a large quantity of very small dish that are then used to put candles in and celebrate light. And it's a very important ritual. And you see here the making of those little bowls. They're decorating and then their use. Ron Rivera, an American potter, started Potters for Peace to go all over the world in communities where water was contaminated and make ceramic filters that would then be positioned over a plastic bucket with a spigot, and the water would be placed into the fired ceramic container, filtered through and remove bacteria and pollutants from the water and add to the health of the community. And he's done this for decades now with thousands of potters all over the world in hundreds and hundreds of communities. This is a very interesting use of the principle of evaporation present in ceramic material that are porous. Mohammed Abbas from Nigeria invented the produce cooler by putting a pot inside a pot with sand in between the two of them. And then if you put, let's say, tomato inside the interior container and pour water in the sand, as the water evaporates, it drops the temperature of the ensemble and will create cooling of the tomato and their preservation. Those tomatoes would probably go bad in 2-3 days, and while using the produce cooler invented by Mr. Abbas, the tomato can then last for up to a week or even more. And in India, this other inventor created a mini-cooled fridge on the same principle. It's a double-wall fridge that can be filled in water between the two walls, and as the water evaporates, the temperature drops inside the container and it creates a no electricity, totally sustainable fridge. Something very interesting about the Amazon rainforest is that we consider it to be a wild environment, a natural environment where humans had very little interaction, which is not true at all, because archaeologists have found what we call terra preta all over the Amazon, where the native tribes would have made pots for the specific use of breaking them and then mixing them with the topsoil and carbon coming from firing, and this would modify the soil, add to its quality, and it would improve the growing of food. And thousands of square kilometers of the Amazon have actually been transformed by terra preta, by changing the nature of the soil by the addition of fired clay shards. There are many examples of this ecological approach to ceramics in the contemporary world. This is an example by Ximena Garrido Leca, using pipes in ceramics to control the distribution of water and the growing of plants. This is a water cistern found in Mayan world in Mexico, and the Mayans would go with their pots to the well and the cistern to collect water, and sometimes the pot would break and they would be dropped, and we have all those shards remaining at the bottom of the cistern that help archaeologists define the type of wares they were making, the size of those ware, how they were used, and for what purposes. An example of an Acoma Pueblo Ola, which is a type of jar for the collecting and transporting of water from the bottom of mesas. The Pueblo people often lived on mountain tops to protect themselves, and they would grow corn at the bottom in the valley. And the design of those pots is specifically made so that once filled with water and set on the head, they would be transported without any loss of water that would drip in and out in the movement of the carrier. And American artist Brooke Levan made a water bottle, which we know from plastic examples, but he made a ceramic version of it to connect present and past and issues of preservation and sustainability in the contemporary world. I've shown you those wonderful jars from India. Again, they're made to cool water through evaporations. If you put water in those jars, leave it for a while, water will evaporate through the porous clay, and the water temperature will drop significantly and keep it cool to offer to your guests when they come to your home. And those pots are still made in India and still used for that ritual hospitality purpose in Indian houses. Example of watering cans and pouring vessels for gardening. So the connections to food and gardening and the growing of food is an important one. And ceramic implements of all kinds, one from France in medieval times, one from China, probably much older, on the right. Another connections between ceramic and food is the collections of manure from animals, and those are pigeon coop to collect fertilizers. So the buildings are made out of bricks and clay in Iran. They are to contain thousands of pigeons who roost in those structures, and in the process produce a lot of manure that's collected at the bottom, brought to the fields as a fertilizer. Also from Iran, we have cool air storage made out of ceramics to keep ice in the desert. So in winter times when it's cold, ice would be collected, put into those brick-built structures, which are very large in size, and then the ice would be preserved over the warm month throughout the year through the specific material used to build those structures and their shape and their ventilation system inside. And that's an interesting connection again between ceramic and food in various cultures. In Turpan, China, we have those grape drying structures that are made specifically for the drying of grapes. So the region is a grape growing regions, and beautiful brick structures, sometimes fired bricks, sometimes raw bricks. It depends because there is very little rain in Turpan. So they can be made in both material with wonderful designs in the openings in the wall for the circulation of air that will then dry the raisins contained inside. We have looked before in the simulation aesthetic at those wonderful melon serving dishes, many of them made at Chelsea factory in England in the 18th century, and also deeply connected to the serving and the eating of food. Once you open this dish, there may have been a melon-based dessert inside, and creating a connection between the object and its purpose. You remember as well this object where game pie dishes were designed in England by Wedgwood and other manufacturers during the wars with Napoleon, when there was a shortage of wheat, which made the making of pastry difficult, and special pottery dishes imitating pastries were made. And we've also looked at trompe-l'oeil and realist objects that depicts various seeds and elements from nature, and an artichoke from Meissen on the right. There are a large number of examples of this all over Europe and all over the world. I really like those two examples from Peru, from pre-Columbian time, from the moche cultures, and this potato head on the left, and again this potato stirrup vessel on the right. You have peanuts. We tend to forget that a lot of food staples come from the America. Tomatoes, potatoes, peanuts, squash, and many, many more, like rubber, for example, and chocolate, for one. And the moche made a lot of stirrup vessels that represent various fruits and vegetables and seeds that they would grow and collect for their needs. This is a peanut man from the moche culture, and the god of cacao from Mayan cultures with the seeds, the pods of cacao around his necklace. You have a deer, which would also have been a food staple, or a gourd on the right. So it's those objects again, here you have a turkey, male and female, and it is also a whistling vessel, which I've talked about in the industrial aesthetic previously. And so when you put water into those containers and pour it out, it creates the whistle sound of both the male and female turkey bird. Here you have an example from the mochi period again of people processing food. And again, objects for the cooking of food and the serving of food are quite common. And from those objects we learn a tremendous amount about the culture, about the food they ate, the food they grew, the food they cooked, and how they served it, and how they absorbed it, and so on. And this is a plate with a beautiful design of the maize god on a turtle, part of the mythology and the spiritual religion of those cultures. A Mayan pot on the left with a screw top for the containment of chocolate, a jar for tobacco, and a smoker from Casas Grandes in northern Mexico. So we know that the pot on the left is for chocolate and the one in the middle for tobacco, because the glyph on the pot says in Mayan script that this is a pot for the use of chocolate serving, and the middle one for the containment of tobacco. Dogs were also a food staple in many cultures. You have an example from Han Dynasty China on the left, and one from Colima culture from Mexico on the right. I really like those two vessels. You have this head with an open mouth from pre-Columbian cultures of America, and this beautiful breast bowl designed by Jean-Jacques Lagrené at Sèvres, and it's a breast cup for the serving and drinking of milk, made for Marie Antoinette when she was Queen of France at that time. I'm sorry for the mistake to the date. It would be 1766-68 to be correct. This is a cup of Pythagoras, and what's interesting about it, you have a cross-section of it on the left and an actual one on the right. If you put wine or any liquid in it and you go past the carved line, the whole content of the wine drips to the ground. So it's to show you to maintain control over consumption and not overuse resources, and not drink too much and not be too greedy. In many places in the world up to this day, you can find very cheaply made ceramic objects for the serving of street food. And in India, you can buy lassi and yogurt on the street. And once you've drank your lassi or eaten your yogurt, you can just throw the bowl away because they're very worthless and very, very cheaply made. And I've bought myself this example in Mexico for lemonade. The vase is thrown on the wheel, trimmed and bisqued, and brought to the middle of Mexico City for selling lemonade. The lemonade cost me 10 cents. The vase was basically free, and I could throw it away on the ground, as did everybody, all the other customers after use. But I kept mine just to show you how cheaply ceramic can be in various contexts. An example of a throwaway pot from Turkey, those kebab pot, which are made specifically for the cooking of this stew, and after buying the pot containing the stew, you break the pot to access the interior food and then just throw away the container. In the reading for next week, I talk about the difference between Korean, Chinese, and Japanese rice bowls, and those are examples of each one of them, and how the same object for the same purpose can be designed and used very differently depending on the traditions of each of those cultures. I really like those ceramic plates for the extension of lips that we find in some cultures in Ethiopia. Now I will go a bit again over revolutionary wares because their connections to food can be quite interesting. Those are from Russia just after the revolution, and they were painted of porcelain at a time when food was rare and there was a famine and people were dying from lack of food. So it's interesting that this plate with food products, this is what the text in Cyrillic actually says, and the images of food is on the plate at a time when food was difficult to come by for actual eating. And I really like this plate by Mikhail Adamovich on the right, which says, again in Russian, "He who doesn't work doesn't eat." And two images of famine scenes where people were dying from hunger and famine, and this was communicated through propaganda ware on those wonderful plates from Russia. Two other examples here with again corn and wheat on the plate, and on the right, in aid to the famine, the great reaper. So this worker and soldier is trying to kill famine and death as an image on the plate, and beautifully painted and quite a wonderful object. At the time in Russia, the American government sent a lot of aid to Russia in the form of grain and wheat and flour and so on and so forth. And this is a little figurine by Natalia Danko showing American meal on the bag. And on the right, another example by Nina Zander with harvesting scenes and tools and so on. And this wonderful tea set by Adamovich, again, showing how porcelain and revolution and the growth and production and harvesting of food are all connected together intimately. Sometimes those designs are greatly reduced and minimalized. You have on the right the sickle and hammer of the emblem of the Russian revolutions in a very stylized design. So there was a deep connection between ceramics and avant-garde development in abstraction happening at the time, and the initiator of abstraction in painting and in art, Kazimir Malevich, designed suprematist plate and teapots and cups as well of great minimal design. Nicolas Suetin was another suprematist designer and artist, and this is one of his coffee set. I've shown you this French royalist plate again from China, made from the supporters of the royalty in France around 1795. And in that plate are hidden the profile of the king and queen and their two children. We find the same phenomenon in Chinese revolutionary porcelain, where at the time of great upheaval in China and also famine, there was a lot of propaganda ware showing the development in agriculture and so on. And I really like this greatly forward propaganda ware bowl, which says, "Overthrowing American imperialism." And those kinds of scenes were used as propaganda to celebrate harvest at a time when harvest was in short supply in the country. So there are all kinds of modernist and avant-garde artists who interfaced with ceramic. Futurist dinnerware by Giacomo Balla. The work of Sonia Delaunay in France from the 1930s. Designs made by Frank Lloyd Wright, the celebrated American architect, for the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo in 1924. And again, a reminder of the work of Bruce Bairnsfeder with those war scenes on dinnerware that he designed just after the First World War, and that were quite popular. And again, two more examples from Russia, where you have soldiers guarding the harvest in both of those plates. Now I have a brief section that I call Food for Thought, where the objects are not really functional objects and they're not really meant to be used, but they are bowls and containers that represent scenes of daily life, like this village on the left with animals and people at the market and the king and queen sitting on their throne. And on the right, this landscape with a shepherd watching his sheep, and the edge of the pole become the horizon of the valley, and you have a whole world represented inside a bowl. And there are many examples of that all over the world, where you have wonderful ceramic objects with animals and scenes of all kinds, like smiting on the right, or bowls that become boats carrying people and carrying goods and engaging with exchanges and marketing with other people. I really like those little bowls from Inca on the left and from Cyprus on the right, where the little birds are ready to drink whatever is contained into the object. Cavaliers in a procession around a bowl, going somewhere and making connections with other places and other cultures, and this tiny little couple embracing inside a Romanian bowl from the Neolithic period. So those objects, again, are found all over the world, and their connections to food is an interesting one for a variety of reasons. They were often made for offering in tombs, and here you have a Chinese pavilion with animals and people engaged in all kinds of activities in this object. Beautiful example again from Han Dynasty China with acrobats and a scene of a tree in the middle of a lake on the right. And this very beautiful oil lamp from Iran that represents a fountain with water dripping out and birds drinking in the water and so on. And it's a beautiful example of the combinations of form and surface and the use of color with form to generate the idea of fluidity and water and freshness in an object that would have been filled with oil with a whisk at the side and a flame creating light as well. So there is wonderful connections between all those elements in this object. And then this set of dishes by Dan Flavin, the celebrated light artist, American light artist, who did this design for the company Artes Magnus. And Dan Flavin is interested in light as a material. So on his set of dishes, the color is underneath the rim of the dish. So when you put the dish on a tabletop that's white, it gets colored by reflection from the projection of the light over the white surface from the color that's underneath each one of those dishes. Again, almost every time I show you those wonderful dishes by Bernard Palissy, coming from a variety of chapters. And again, these connections between nature and culture that we find in his work is deeply connected to our connection to food. The work of Okada Kenzan, who also makes its appearance repeatedly in those presentations, because of the interesting connection to food, where food would be placed strategically on the plate on the left, and people would have to guess the relationship between the object and its image and the food presented and the time of the year at which this food would have been served. And Kitaoji Rosanjin, following in the footsteps of Kenzan in mid-century Japan, mid-20th century Japan, revived the aesthetic of Kenzan and the making of those types of ware for the serving of food. Kitaoji Rosanjin was a very celebrated artist and potter, but he was also a famous cook, and he owned a restaurant in the middle of Tokyo, And when an earthquake hit, his restaurant was destroyed and all the dishes were broken. So he said, I need to reopen my restaurant and I need to find good dishes. So he said, well, I might as well make them myself. And that's how he became a famous potter, by making dishes for the need of his own restaurant where he was the main cook. Wayne Higby in American ceramics, making those wonderful landscape bowls with the interactions between interior and exterior, form and surface, image and object, which I mentioned periodically in both those presentations and in the reading I assign. Richard DeVore, another American potter, making pots that are meant to contain themselves, basically. They are not meant to contain anything else but their own presence in space. Examples of that in the work of Mary Rogers, but also in the work of Kim Dickey, who made those very quirky and unusual vessel forms that she would actually use in the serving of food around ritual for friends, and she would cook and prepare and serve specific foods in those specific dishes around rituals with family and friends. Kiki Smith, the celebrated American artist, with this ceramic bowl containing internal organs, and Sarah O'Senton, when she was a student at Emily Carr, made cross-section of the stomach dishes using anatomical drawings and studies from book of the stomach and how it looks like anatomically, creating a set of dinnerware representing that connections between ceramic object, dishes, and the stomach and food. Two more examples by Cristina Bertoni, again examples meant to contain themselves and have a whole universe within their basic, simple, and small shapes and forms. And then Toni Marsh doing something similarly here by filling the form with other forms that completely take the space of the containment of the object. Judy Chartrand, working in Vancouver with her celebrated Downtown East Side dishes with cockroaches, and this pie dish from America that says, "Why will you die?" A very interesting question, also connected to food in its consumption as a necessity of life. Those double cups by Mona Atoum with all kinds of interesting connections to bodies and uses and performative aspects. Robert Arneson, Things Go Better with Coke, No Deposit, No Return from 1962. One of the very first ceramic objects made by an American artist with the total denial of function embedded in form thrown on the wheel that are themselves representing containers but could not be used in any way. And at the time in 1962, this was a very radical and revolutionary gesture that created a lot of controversy. Anthony Grumley with this piece of bread body with pieces of bread that have been eaten in the shape of his own body. So it's just a stack of dry bread that represents two concave aspects of his own corpse. And Amanda Church, when she was a student at Emily Carr, designed this starving child dinner set and utensils. So the utensils are various dinner service dishes that could be used, but that are in the shape of a child starving of hunger. And this wonderful play by Paul Scott from England around the various aspects of cow. You have a bone china plate made with the bone of a cow. It's a meat carving dish for the carving of meat, and it shows images of cow carcasses that are burnt and destroyed because they are affected with foot and mouth disease. So in the same objects, you have three aspects of cow-related things in a dish, and this conflation of various things related to cow and food and so on and so forth in one object is something one finds in a ceramic objects in a way that would basically be impossible in any other art form. Two wonderful objects by Wedgwood from around 1800, an egg beater. You break the egg, you put the lid on, you shake it up, and then you have an instant omelette. I don't exactly know how you clean it very well though. And an invalid feeder for feeding someone who is sick in bed and has difficulty ingesting solid food. This wonderful set of 13 plates for 13 people by Marek Ciciola, the Polish-American Jewish potter and designer, and it's a scene of the Last Supper. So it can be taken apart, it can be used. They're functional objects with transfer printed digital ceramic prints. And when assembled in a strategic way, they recompose the famous painting by Leonardo da Vinci. And the very last image for today are those plates that I designed, which I call begging and grabbing bowls and plates. So in each object, whether it is a plate or a bowl, you have the image of a hand, and if the hand is in one direction, it is begging, and if it is in the other direction, it is grabbing, which are the two things we do in life. We either are missing something and we want more of it, or we have too much of it through greed. And through this simple use of a hand in those bowls and plates that are functional objects meant to be used, you have both aspects contained within a single object. So thank you for listening to this presentation around food. Next week we will have a presentation around architecture in ceramic in the theme of shelter, and I look forward to have you with me again for this presentation. Have a good week.